I'm Tom and I make electronic music under the name Bamboo Leaves. Today, we are going to dissect a track in the style of Tom Misch that you just heard in the introduction. Tom Misch makes groovy and soulful beats that blends hip-hop drum samples, jazzy chords, and intricate guitar licks. I really enjoy listening to Tom Misch and appreciate the range in his musical production techniques along with his capacity for musical performance. If you find this tutorial useful, make sure to like for the YouTube algorithm and subscribe for more videos like this. So let's break down this track. The first thing to note that this isn't a particularly complex production, but there's a lot of attention to detail in the sound choices and the groove that's achieved throughout the track. What I'm going to do is I'm going to work from left to right as the instruments come in, and I'll explain the different elements and mixing techniques that I've used to achieve this sound. I'll focus on these sine chords first. With these sine chords, there's kind of two elements to the sound. One is the sine wave tone, and then the other is this sort of noise overlay. To achieve this sound, I've used Serum. It's completely overkill for the sound that I've done because I'm only really blending some sine waves and some noise together. It could be repeated with lots of different software synths. The same techniques apply. I have activated the sub, which has some sine waves as a default, and I have also activated the noise oscillator. So what I'll do is I'll play it just with the sine waves. That sounds nice, and that's pretty much the sound we've got. So what I wanted to do was add a bit more texture to that sound, so that's why I have brought this noise to just layer in subtly on top of it. There's not much more to say for the sound design on this one. In terms of processing, I have got a gain to make sure that this sound is monoed. I've made sure that I've turned mono on here so that it just pulls everything into the middle, and I don't want any of the frequencies outside because I really want to box in this sound right in front of the listener. The next bit of processing I've got on these is I have rolled off a little bit of the absolute top end and some of the bottom end. It just softens that noise just a little bit, and that's what I thought this sound needed. I've got this sound bust going to two different buses. I have a rotor cabinet that I am bussing a small amount of the sound to, and I also have it bust to another bus which has a Logic chorus on it. It just adds a little bit more to the sound. I've got that really mono signal that the chorus is then just sort of widening a small amount. An important thing to note about this track is that I have actually routed the output to bus 10 instead of stereo out. This is so that I could route the full sound to a single bus and then put some sidechaining on that bus. You'll notice later that actually a lot of the instruments are also bussed to this same bus rather than putting sidechain on each of the tracks. They all go into one, and one sidechain piece of processing is being applied to it. On that bus 10, I just have an LFO tool doing the sidechaining, so I'll deactivate it and play it again. And now activate it. The next sound we can hear in this introduction part is this wide pad that I've called it. So this sound is actually the same chords pretty much as the sine chords, and is also the same sound source for the synthesizer in Serum. You can just see that here. It's the same thing with the sub and the noise oscillators activated. I have applied some additional FX processing in order to kind of create that sort of more wobbly, paddy kind of sound. I'll play it without any processing. So I first have a gain on there to make it really mono like I did with the other one. I've also introduced a Logic tremolo. On this tremolo, I've brought the symmetry from, I think it defaults to about 50%, all the way down to about maybe 1%. so that the tremolo doesn't sort of have a smooth up and down and up and down. It kind of starts high and then descends quite quickly. So do, 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 do. I'll leave it off and activate it. So that effect is the thing that kind of gives the creative texture to this sound specifically. The next bit of processing I've got on there is a echo with a 1/8 note. So we're getting a bit more kind of glitchy with it, and it's sort of making a bit more of like a wobbly, weird sound. Next, I have an EQ applied to it. I have rolled off a lot of the low end, some of the high end, and I've boosted the mid range. So I've got this bandpass filter that's on there. I'll play without and then with it. Now with it. So like this sound is starting to shape up now. Next, I have a Valhalla reverb, creating more of a textured pad sound. And finally, a sample delay that is actually now pushing the signal right out to the left and to the right. Again, on that track, it's worth noting that it has also been bussed to bus 10 to take advantage of that side chaining. The next sound we have is this steel drum sample that is going on. This is just a steel drum sample in the Logic sampler. It's called Caribbean Steel Drums. I have just got a EQ, so I'm rolling off a lot of the low end and a small amount of the high end to tame those in. I've got a gain on there where I've turned the mono on to make sure that the signal is right in the middle where I want it. I've got a compressor on there to just rein in some of those dynamics, and I've got a Soothe 2 on there to do some subtractive EQ. This is probably quite important because the steel drum sound has quite a lot of harsh harmonics in it, and using something like Soothe 2 or just doing some subtractive EQ will be quite beneficial with sounds that they have a lot of harmonics that you want to tame some of those harsher resonant frequencies. Moving on to the next track, we have a kick drum. This is really simple. If I just zoom in on that one, it's some kick sample that's quite sort of acoustic sounding. So it sort of is actually sampled from a kick drum rather than it's been sort of electronically generated, for example. And I've got a fade on there to make sure that it's really short and snappy. For this, I've just taken out some of those sub-frequencies because it's sort of a bit too much for me, and I've boosted some of the top end to just sort of retain a bit more air in the sound. Next, we have these introductory hi-hats. They're kind of quite low in the mix, quite subtle, but they're there to just kind of give a bit more of the groove to this introduction. So for these ones, you can kind of see where they're being positioned on the grid. I have two different hi-hat sounds. I have one where it is a closed hi-hat and another where it's a slightly opened hi-hat. I've transposed one of the samples down by 5 and another one that's actually not been transposed at all. I feel like the closed hi-hat just needed to be brought down so it had a lower, crunchier kind of tone for this introductory part. In terms of processing on those hi-hats, I just have an EQ to roll off some of the low end. I'm taking out a bit of the high end, but I'm not fully rolling them off. And also I have a sample delay that is delaying the signal by a small amount. I'll actually get into this more later on when some other hi-hats get in and sort of describe why I've done that. That's it for the first introductory part. We'll just move on to the next part. The only thing that I've introduced here is this sub bass sound. So I'll just solo that and we can have a listen. For this one, I have just used the quick sampler with the default patch initialized, which is just some sine waves. It's playing really low, so we're entering the sub range, so it's giving a really sort of rumbly bass sub sound. I've got a compressor on there to rein in some of the frequencies. I've got an overdrive on the track. This is actually quite important because what I wanted to do is I wanted to give this sub less of a clean sound. So instead of a sine wave that's just really clean, just a pure tone, I wanted to add a little bit of harmonics so that someone might be able to hear it if they didn't necessarily have some speakers that went as low as the sub range. So when you add an overdrive, you actually introduce some harmonics to the sound and you round off some of the frequencies. And so what I want to do is I'll show you the difference between the EQ profile with the overdrive turned on and the overdrive turned off. So I've got an EQ before the overdrive, that's this one here, and then I've also got an EQ after the overdrive, which is this one over here. I'll play this and then we can see the difference between the two frequency profiles. Can you see that the EQ on the right actually has this extra harmonic in this range as opposed to this one over here? If I deactivate the overdrive, that harmonic will disappear, and then we've just got the clean tone that's in the sub range. And because they're higher up in the frequency range, they're more audible to the human ear. Moving on to the next section where we have some hi-hats and some claps that come in. So this is where I want to address the sort of the swing and groove to this track. I will solo the kick and the new set of hi-hats that come in, and we can sort of dissect the groove in here. I have got these hi-hats, they are directly on the offbeat of this grid. However, that's not necessarily a particularly attractive groove, and it doesn't really fit the Tom Misch style to have a hi-hat that is directly on the offbeat. In order to add a bit more swing and groove to the beat, I have actually introduced this sample delay, where I'm delaying the signal by 758 samples. And what that's doing is that's pushing the actual sound just a little bit further off that offbeat, and it's kind of providing a bit more swing to the beat. So what I'll do is I'll deactivate it, and we can kind of hear the difference between activated and deactivated as to the swing that it introduces to the track. This is with it deactivated. Activate it. It's quite subtle, but it adds a little bit more groove, and I can actually emphasize that swing a lot more by bringing the delay up. Introducing this delay onto those off beats on the hi-hat can give your track a bit more swing rather than the sort of the robotic but. Just a note on that track, I have some EQ rolling off the low end and also a soothe to just sort of tame some of the harsher frequencies of that hi-hat. I also have a reverb that's really subtle that's on there. The next thing I want to talk about are these claps. For this one, I have dragged a MPC clap sample into the quick sampler so I could have a bit more control over the actual sample start time. I'll show you that next. I'll just play it and then we can listen to how it sounds. So nothing too fancy there, but there's a few things to note on this. One is that I've actually brought the sample start up a little bit. So initially, the sample would sound like this. It would have a few more sort of transients in that clap. I've also faded out the end of it so that it had a snappier finish to it. So if I deactivate that fade, let me bring the fade back in. You can hear that tightens up a bit. And also, what I'll do is I brought the sample start in just a small amount to take out a few of those transients because I wanted it, again, a little bit tighter. I'll play it, then I'll bring the sample start in a little bit and we can see how that affects the sound. Yeah, that's about where I wanted it. I think on this kind of track, we have these kind of dry, not too processed sounding claps that sound quite real. It actually sounds like a person or a group of people have clapped rather than some sort of drum machine that's synthesizing a clap that you get on some other genres that might sort of maybe use 808s or 909 claps on their tracks. Let's just solo the drums and we can kind of hear how the groove shapes up with all of these sounds together. I missed out this other hi-hat here. It's just something I've brought in. It's the open hi-hat sound. I've just sort of brought it in again to kind of give a bit more swing, and I've just put it just before the second hi-hat hits. So that's where you can kind of hear that. And finally, we have this final section where I have brought in a guitar lick. I've just played that in on my guitar. I haven't processed them too much in terms of sort of best practices, I'd say, but I just wanted to give them a bit more something so that it sort of sounded better in the mix. So I'll just play this last section now. It comprises of two different tracks. So one of them's playing the lick a little bit lower, and then the other one is it's playing it a whole octave higher. Something like that. I've doubled up the tracking, so that's why there's 4 here. There's 2 on the lower end and 2 on the higher octave. To make sure that the sound was nice and tight, I have cut it up and pulled the different transients closer to on the beat to make sure that it was sort of, it can make up for my playing ability. I've effectively quantized it to the beat. Because I just DI'd the signal in directly from my guitar to the preamp, I didn't have any tone or amplifiers applied, so I've used the Logic amp modeling and pedal board modeling to get a tone that I liked. I've had things like compression, and I've added things like gain to make sure that the signal's really monoed. I've also bussed all of the guitar sounds to a single guitar bus so that I could process them all together, so they each independently have some processing applied. And then I've also bussed them together and applied processing on them as a whole to kind of push them a little bit harder and make it sound a bit more aggressive. On that guitar bus, I have an EQ that I have boosted some high mids on and rolled off the absolute top ends and low ends. I've got, again, some further compression. I've got an expander on there to make the sort of boost the dynamics a little bit more. So I think on the transients of the plucks, it will sort of boost that signal a little bit more, give it a little bit more energy. I've got a reverb on there to give like a bit of a room sound to it. And then I've got a limiter on there to just make sure that the sound doesn't go outside of the box that I want it to go into in terms of dynamic range. So once again, the guitars with the rest of the track. There we have it. Thanks for watching to the end. Again, make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you have any questions and I'll try to answer them in the comments. Otherwise, that's a wrap.